Now, can you all hear me? I hope you can. Um, you're very welcome to the new disembodied world of webinars. Fergus Finlay is my name, and I'm delighted to be hosting this very, very timely seminar organized by the Children's Rights Alliance on child poverty. Child poverty is and has been for many years one of the great moral and political issues of our time. You wouldn't necessarily think so from the amount of media and political attention it gets, but it is not just a troubling issue, but in my view is one of the great scandals of a rich first world country, that so many of our children live in poverty and the fear in poverty. And of course, at the more extreme end, so many children live without a home. So the purpose of today is to shine a light on that, to try and come up with suggestions, ideas, and proposals. And it couldn't be more timely. I heard on the news at lunchtime today that the government is moving its budget, or potentially moving its budget, from October into September, which is helpful, I guess. But this has been an issue that is not related to the current rate of inflation. It's not related to the war in Ukraine. It's not related to supply chain problems. It's an issue that has and ought to have troubled us for a long, long time. The structure of today is pretty simple and straightforward. We're going to have a presentation from Hugh Fraser, excuse me, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Then we're going to have inputs from our political panel, and we're delighted to have been joined by representatives of all of the political parties in Dáil Éireann. We have Kathleen Funchion from Sinn Féin, Nessa Harrigan from the Green Party, Paul Murphy from People Before Profit, Fiona O'Loughlin from Fianna Fáil, Éoin O'Riordan from Labour, Mary Siri Carney from Fine Gael, Paddy Rubin from Aontú, and Jennifer Whitmore from the Social Democrats. And I'm looking forward to having a quick chat with each of them later on. To try and set the scene for us, to try to describe what's going on and what can be done, I'm delighted, first of all, to introduce Hugh Fraser. Hugh Fraser is an expert on European policies to combat poverty and social exclusion, especially child poverty. I've known Hugh for many, many years. He was fearless, independent, and direct leader of the Combat Poverty Agency when it existed in Ireland. I always thought it was one of the great ironies of Irish life. We went through a phase I guess you might call it a phase of political ideology in Ireland, where the demand was to cull quangos, to get rid of unnecessary quangos. But almost the only quangos that were got rid of at the time were organizations that were necessary, organizations that were independent, organizations that had a voice, and that maybe said things that the government of the day didn't particularly want to hear. Combat poverty was one of the first to be abolished as part of that ideological move. Another one was the Centre for Early Childhood Play and Development, Early Childhood Education and Development, I beg your pardon. So it's fairly easy to see that organizations that focused on issues of poverty and issues of children weren't regarded as particularly necessary back in the day, but they've never been more necessary than they are now. Hugh has co-authored and edited the final reports of phases 1 and 2 of the feasibility study for an EU child guarantee for the European Commission. He's an adjunct professor in the Department of Applied Social Studies in Maynooth University, and is currently the independent chair of the Dublin City Community Cooperative. I'm looking forward to Hugh's insight of the benefit of a strengthened EU approach to address child poverty, and to share some insights that we can apply here. So can I hand the floor to Hugh, please?
Thank you very much, Fergus, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm delighted to be taking part in this event, but I guess I'm also disappointed to be taking part. I'm delighted because I have a great lot of time for the work of the Children's Rights Alliance, and it's always interesting to be part of these events, and it's great that you're keeping the issue of child poverty to the fore. But I suppose I'm disappointed because I guess I spent most of the last 3 decades working on issues of child poverty. And it's really disappointing that we're back here again talking about child poverty and the need to eliminate it and what needs to be done. One would have hoped we might have made more progress than we actually have. In my input, I'm going to say a bit about the European context, particularly on child poverty, and why the changes in the European context, I think, is potentially going to create more momentum at national level for tackling child poverty. So perhaps go to the next slide, please. So just to stress that child poverty is a major challenge for the European Union. Nearly 1 in 4 children, that's 23.8%, are at risk of poverty or social exclusion in the EU. And that's Irish figure is very similar at 23.6%, so we're around about the European average. And I think also there's a lot of evidence now at European level, and particularly over the information that we collected over 3 years on the child guarantee, that some children are at especially high risk. And I have a list there, I won't go through it all, but I'm sure they're familiar with you, of the children that have emerged, particularly at risk of poverty at European level. I think also at European level, the recent crises have made people more aware of the impact of child poverty. Certainly the COVID-19 crisis led to a greater recognition of poverty and inequality and social determinants of health affecting children badly in the context of COVID, and made people more aware of those underlying factors that were already there and in many cases were exacerbated. More recently, of course, we have the Ukraine conflict, and related to that is also the increased cost of living crisis. And I think particularly that's highlighted at European level with big problems about migration, new challenges about energy poverty, and also I think it's highlighted across European countries, and the Commission is now more aware of the weaknesses in many countries' child protection systems. And then I think we also have to take into account the environmental and sustainable development crisis that we all face. And I think also there's a growing awareness that children are particularly potentially affected by that, firstly through increased immigration because of climate change, but also the risks for families in poverty if we don't have a just transition. So I think that's more on the European agenda than before. And then I think the other thing I've noticed at European level is there's much more talk within policy development at European level about intergenerational perpetuation of poverty. And I think what's been recognized that underpinning that intergenerational perpetuation of poverty is child poverty, and that child poverty is one of the issues you need to address if we're going to break the perpetuation of poverty. So next slide, please. All this has led to, I think, a strengthened approach at European level to child poverty. And in particular, we have the European Child Guarantee that was adopted last year after about 3 or 4 years, considerable amount of work on it. And the overall objective is to prevent and combat social exclusion by guaranteeing the access of children in need to a set of key services. It's seen as a contribution to the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And it stresses the importance of breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty and building back after COVID. And it's important, I think, also to look at the European Pillar of Social Rights, because that reflected a recognition at European level that social policy needed to be strengthened at the European dimension. And the pillar is quite important in regards to that. And within that, particularly Principle 7 of the European Pillar on childcare and support to children, and it particularly names that children have the right to protection from poverty, and children from disadvantaged backgrounds have the right to specific measures to enhance equal opportunities. But it's also, I think, important to note that there are other principles of the pillar that are very relevant. There's principles 5 to 10 on fair employment, principle 13 on adequate unemployment benefits, and 14 on adequate income, principle 19 on housing and assistance for homelessness. And we now have from the Commission an action plan to implement the Pillar of Social Rights. And the European Child Guarantee is seen as part of that action plan and part of the way that they're going to address and achieve the principles set out in relation to children. Also, at the same time as the European Child Guarantee, we had a new EU strategy on the rights of the child, and that's closely linked to the Child Guarantee and talks about an EU that fights child poverty, promotes inclusive and child-friendly societies, health and education. I think also significant is that we now have an EU poverty target in relation to children. The Child Guarantee Action Plan has an overall target of 15 million people being lifted out of poverty and social exclusion by 2030. At least 5 million should be children. So that is a new development, to have a target in relation to children. Of course, it's perhaps a little unambitious, but at least it's significant to have a European level target. I think another important development has been in relation to the structural funds and the new round of structural funds running to 2027. Not only does it give an increased focus on using structural funds to address poverty and social exclusion, but very specifically to tackle child poverty and to support the implementation of the European Child Guarantee, and very particularly that the ESF plus countries that are below the average rate or above the average EU poverty rate for 2017 to 19 figures have to commit 5% of their ESF plus to that. And that includes Ireland. At that time, we were above the European rate. And I think it's a potentially important development in use of EU funds. And then it's also the EU's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it talks in Goal 1 of the aims to halve the number of children, women, and men in poverty by 2030. So overall, there is a significant new series of things at the EU level that can be used to put poverty back onto national agendas. Can we move to the next slide? Just to say a little bit more about the European Child Guarantee, and many of you will know much more of the detail of this, but just to say what the guarantee is, it guarantees for children in need effective and free access to early childhood education and care, education and school-based activities, at least one healthy meal each school day, and also effective access to healthy nutrition and adequate housing. The guarantee gives a very specific focus to children who are most disadvantaged or are most at risk and face particular disadvantages. It stresses the importance of building an integrated approach to tackle child poverty and an enabling policy framework in countries. It requires the appointment by each member state of a national coordinator. It stresses the importance of countries developing national action plans right up to 2030. It requires the involvement of stakeholders in the process of developing and implementing and monitoring plans. It gives a big stress to the use of EU funding in support of the implementation of the guarantee. And it puts in place potentially quite rigorous monitoring and reporting of what member states are doing and achieving to implement the guarantee. So to move to the next slide. So just from all of that, what is the importance for Ireland of the strengthened EU approach? Well, I think, of course, the first importance is that it gives a high-level political priority. And I think that potentially does increase pressure for national action to tackle poverty. The way it's been structured, I think, reinforces the three pillar approach that was developed back in 2013 by the European Commission in investing in children and breaking the cycle of disadvantage, which emphasizes the need both to address access to income through measures in relation to access to work and income support, access to services, which is what the Child Guarantee particularly looks at, and the participation of children in decisions that affect them and in cultural and social and recreational activities. I think European approach emphasizes a long-term comprehensive and strategic approach, and that's evident with the national action plans and building a supportive enabling policy framework. It puts emphasis, I think, on member states looking at children's rights. Very much the Child Guarantee has been written in the context of a child rights approach and the EU strategy on the rights of the child. Importantly, I think it puts a lot of emphasis on clearer identification of children most at risk. So it's not just poverty generally, but a particular need to recognize some children slip through the net when policies have been developed, and it highlights particular groups of children. And I think that's also important because it requires that we get much better data and monitoring of children who are most at risk. Often they don't appear in a lot of the data sets that are available on child poverty at European level. Next slide. It certainly, I think, the European initiative reinforces the need for enhanced policy coordination at national level. And that's why they've insisted on the appointment of national coordinators in each member state. Certainly, it's going to increase monitoring and reporting here in Ireland, but also at European level. There's going to have to be biannual reporting on progress. It'll be linked into the European semester process. I understand the Social Protection Committee will be developing a common monitoring framework to look at the implementation by member states. Certainly for us, I think it will increase the use of EU funds for children at risk in support of policies. And it's an area that we already, I think, have a better record than many countries, but enhancing the policy role of civil society and those most at risk of poverty, especially children. Next slide, please. So I just tried to reflect quickly on the experience of developing the child guarantee and all the evidence collected over years at European level. What might that, if you look back then at the Irish situation, might it suggest to us should be priorities if we are really going to end child poverty? So here's my bid of 10 things, but I'll be very interested to hear the political panel to come up with their solutions and challenges to child poverty. The first area is increased access to income from work. And in particular, I think important will be strengthening policies to enable lone parents to have increased access to the labour market. And that will involve increased participation in hours of work. Also, then I think closely related to that in many ways is increasing our efforts in relation to childcare and after-school provision. That, of course, should be done in the first instance because it's good for children and children in poverty to have proper access. But it's also key to enabling people to work, to be sure that there is proper childcare and after-school provision. And that means making it affordable. I think in Ireland by now we should be working towards establishing a state-provided system of free childcare and after-school provision. And I think that's not an unambitious thing to look for by 2030 to have achieved that. We also need to increase social transfers for families at risk. For example, increasing qualified child increases, working family payments, one-parent family payments, etc. And I think the ESRI's report, I think earlier this month, looking at this and the potential of this area was extremely useful and shows what could be achieved by significant increases. Also, I think an important area is addressing the cost barriers to participation in education, and that will require significant increases in covering back to school costs. Next area, fourth area, is introducing a right to housing for families with children. And of course, that then needs to be backed by dramatically increasing the supply of social housing stock with much better targeting of children and families in vulnerable situations. The fifth area is developing more effective local coordination and delivery of services for children and their families. I'm very conscious of this from what I hear from groups in Dublin's inner city. And I very much welcome in the Ireland's National Action Plan the idea to pilot some local area child poverty plans. I think that could be a very useful and important development. Next slide. Okay, the sixth area is I think there's a need to increase access to green spaces, to recreational sport and cultural activities in disadvantaged communities. Again, that very much comes from my experience of the COVID crisis, in fact, for kids in the inner city. The next area, I think overall in Ireland, we need to invest in a progressive universalist approach to overcoming barriers and ensuring inclusive access for children in vulnerable situations to mainline services such as education, health, sport, recreation, and culture. Certainly, we need to do more on free school meals. It's a strong bit within the child guarantee. We do quite well for some children, but we need to cover all children who are disadvantaged having access to free school meals. We need to develop the structured involvement of children in the implementation, monitoring, and ongoing development of Ireland's Child Action Plan. I was pleased to note that the Minister said that the plan that's been developed is only the first step. So it's not a static thing, it's something that's going to evolve and develop. And then the final area I just highlight is to emphasize this point, increasing the focus on children most at risk. I'm thinking here particularly, say, of traveller and Roma children, children with disabilities, children in emergency homeless accommodation, children in direct provision in precarious family situations, and currently children from Ukraine, but also I would stress other children faced by seeking asylum. And indeed, I'm very conscious that the response to Ukraine has been great, but it's highlighted the weaknesses for other children coming to this country. And that means, I think, much better earlier intervention through better identification and outreach by our services for children. I think we should be setting and monitoring very specific targets for different groups for ensuring that they're increasing their access to services. And that will mean also further enhancing our national data on children in need. especially at risk groups. I mean, Ireland is better in many ways than a lot of countries on its data on children, but I still think we need more data on some of the groups that get lost in the big studies. So finally, last slide, just in conclusion, what I would say is the persistence of high levels of child poverty is a scandal. I agree very much with Fergus on that. It is a denial of children's rights. It damages children's development and well-being for their future prospects. It leads to adult poverty and intergenerational perpetuation of poverty. It has high costs for society and the economy, and it threatens the prospects of a sustainable future. However, positively, we know the policies that can end child poverty and social exclusion. And I think we must have a positive vision that there should be no children by 2030 who live in poverty, that they all should have their full potential reached and an opportunity to participate as equals in a society. We have the resources, we are a rich country. So finally, I would say we must act now and invest in ambitious action to end child poverty. Thank you. You're muted, Fergus.
I am, Hugh, I'm sorry. The reason you didn't get a round of applause is because we're all muted, and you deserve a round of applause. That was incredibly succinct, and I think very enabling of the discussion we're going to have. I'm really, really grateful. I've only one question, Hugh, before we get into the wider discussion. So, where are we if 2030 is the summit of Everest? Where are we now? Have we even reached the foothills? I know we have formally adopted the child guarantee, but so we haven't, I don't think, appointed coordinators, or we don't have a new national strategy. So where would you say we are?
I haven't done a deep analysis of the Irish National Action Plan for the Child Guarantee, but a quick look at it, I thought it was useful that it pulled together everything that is being done. And I think it did highlight some of the barriers that needed to be addressed. What I suspect it hasn't yet done is to actually say, this is what we will now do in addition, and to address those barriers more actively than what we're already trying to do. So I think it perhaps lacked a bit of that transformative vision that we need to guide what we need to get to 2030. And it also clearly has a lot still to do to make use of EU structural funds and the 5% that is available. Because at the moment, it's only talking about what we do through national funds, which is important and should be increased. But I think there's a lot of things that still need to be done. But I think as a very first step, it's useful. But as you say, it is the foothills. And we need to have a real vision of where we want to be by the end.
So it may be fair to say that we haven't quite reached the foothills then, but we have strapped our knapsacks on our back, as it were.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, I've got ready. Listen, I'm going to turn to our political panel. To remind those tuning in, though, will you please put questions, if you have them, to the political panel in the Q&A box that should be visible to you. And following the discussion online on the Children's Rights Alliance Facebook page, using the hashtag #EndChildPoverty. I mentioned earlier the 8 representatives that we have, and because we have a lot and we don't have an unlimited amount of time, they've all been told that they're going to be subject to very, very strict, perhaps even brutal discipline. I'm going to put one question to each of them. They're all going to have about 3 minutes to answer. And then I hope we will have time for a bit more exchange after that. I'm going to put my questions in the order that they've been given to me, that the names have been given to me. So I'm going to ask first, and I hope yes, I can see her name. I can't see her yet, but I can see Deputy Kathleen Function's name there. So I'm going to ask Kathleen, and it arises, I think, Kathleen, from what you said, which is we have published a child poverty action plan under the guarantee. It is basically a statement of this is what we're doing now. It doesn't yet seem to have in it, this is what we need to do, this is what we intend to do, this is what we will do. At the same time, we're all expecting, certainly people in the children's sector are expecting a new and better edition of the book of the policy framework for children and young people. It's called Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures. Written that to be published next year, and that's an opportunity, I think, for some new thinking. Can I ask you, Kathleen, what you think should be the priorities in terms of a child guarantee and a poverty action plan under that guarantee? How would you phrase the top 2 or 3 priorities?
Thanks, Fergus, and I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. The bells are going off here in the daughter channel or somewhere in the background, so apologies, that's a distraction. Just to say that.
You don't need to vote, Kathleen. You don't need to vote. Just ignore that.
No, I don't. It's not relevant to me. It's just in case people are wondering what's going on. So 3 minutes. It's hard to get a lot in that, but I think we need to look at from the very start. So I actually think we even need to look at our maternity care provision, and in terms of like our public health nurses. It's something I always felt strongly about in terms of visits and supports for new mothers, new parents, particularly maybe facing poverty or at higher risk of poverty, even except around nutrition and that area. I think then if you look at, I suppose, a child's lifespan, so obviously before they're born, maternity, and then if you look at the kind of early years section, so I think the early years and childcare is a really, really big issue. I think that we really need to look at greater public investment in this sector, because it is crucial for a child's development that they have access to that and equal access. It shouldn't be based on whether parents have the ability to pay. And there are so many benefits, particularly as well then around kind of food poverty for children who do go. And we saw that during COVID, that children really were at the loss at times of their maybe creche or childcare facility that was providing them with a safe space, a warm place and a hot meal. So I think we need to see greater public investment in the childcare sector. There's so many issues around child poverty, but I think maternity is one that sometimes maybe we don't talk about and forget about. I think it's important. Definitely, I think the childcare in the early years. And then I think in terms of housing, I suppose, and access to affordable housing, that's such a crucial issue that has a serious effect on children. And it's not just children who are in B&Bs and hotels, which obviously nobody wants to see, but there is so many sort of, I suppose, either hidden homeless, living in very overcrowded or very unsuitable situations. So that's like it all kind of plays a part, like housing has such a big effect on child poverty as well. And then I just really want to briefly mention, because we're kind of coming into that season, and I'm assuming you'll cut me off when my 3 minutes is up, but the whole back to school area. And I think that's something that we need to see, and possibly something that we could try and do this summer, or I would certainly like to see the government do this summer for children and for families in advance of going back to school in September, because parents will know that the lists, the book lists and all the various fees are coming out now, and it's going to put extra pressure on people who are already struggling in terms of food poverty and fuel poverty. So I think that we need to look at increasing the back to school allowance, but also widening out that net so that more people qualify for that, because a lot more people are struggling than we ever would have seen before. And then like in the wider, longer term, there's so many elements to that as well, because we have to be far more inclusive of children with additional needs. That's a major issue as well, in terms of children who aren't getting the same quality of access to school. And then just because I'm from a rural constituency as well, I'm always very conscious of the transport issues that face so many children. And again, there's a cost to that.
Kathleen, I'm going to cut across you there, and there's an awful lot. That back to school thing is I think it's a huge thing. Yep. I'm actually amazed that even if the government thinks there is a very strong case for not having a budget before October, I'm amazed that they haven't addressed that issue.
Major.
And I've advocated for it. I'm also fascinated by your introduction of the community health nursing thing and how important that is. And it's not something that we've talked about nearly enough. Really grateful to you for adding that to the agenda. There was a time when I was young, it's a long time ago, when effectively a child had a right to 5 visits from a community health nurse in the first few years of life. That's all gone now. And I know from working with community health nurses that kids are invited to come to clinics now. They're not visited at home nearly as much. And the kids who come to the clinics are never the kids who need to come to the clinics. And that's a huge issue. I'm grateful for packing so much in, Kathleen.
No bother.
Nasa Horrigan, I hope, is there, and I'm going to come to you next. Are you there, Kathleen?
Yeah, I'm here.
You are. Okay, well done. Nasa, part of the child guarantee, and maybe it's not surprising I'd ask this of the Green Party representative, but part of the child guarantee is access to play. And if there is one area in Irish public policy that is utterly and completely neglected where children are concerned, it's safe places to play, grow, develop, have fun, make friends, etc. Why do you think there's been such a lack of focus on spatial strategies for children? And that's a grand way of putting it, right? Like why so little priority for that area?
Well, I
think a priority for you, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know. I accept that. Look, I suppose it's a perfect storm, really, of a number of issues. One is we don't have a legacy of a particularly joined up thinking in terms of planning. We and look, nowhere is more affected by that than my own constituency, Dublin Central. We would have had a huge pressure on building homes, and of course people need homes. But if you look at, let's say, somewhere like Pelletstown now, that's just up the road from me, they would have built 9,000 to 15,000 units of housing, and we're still waiting on the school to be finished, and that's 10 or 15 years down the line. Now, I'm lucky enough to live in Cabra, which was built in 1932, when we had no money, absolutely no money in the state. And when we built that estate in 1932, we built the school and the church and a row of shops with it. And it's that kind of joined up thinking that we're not always particularly good at in Ireland. And of course, a developer-led system doesn't really help with that. You really need the state to take the lead. The other aspect to it, I guess, is that we tend to be a bit kind of wary of prioritizing green space and also amenity, and not making a differentiation between the two. Because you can see in my area, we have a really high proportion of young children, really young families, and we're losing space. Not just green space in like, as in me and my kids, we go on a stick hunt. We go down to the Phoenix Park and we go on a stick hunt, and that's such like a pointless waste of time in one sense, and so rich and so fascinating to do with kids on another. But also, like, I'm currently doing a bit of work in terms of how many playing pitches do we have, and we're losing them. So you could be down the country and a small GAA group might have a pitch of their own. Well, I can tell you the amount of sports groups in my area that are using the local park is really quite frightening. So I think we underplay that. And of course, I'm going to say that the lack of women and women who have kids and that voice of the family in Irish politics doesn't help this conversation. You need people to say, like, it would be useful for me to be able to roll a pram around a park near me, and to constantly have that brought up. I think what's interesting is, though, that and it speaks to, I guess, what Hugh was saying, and both what Kathleen was saying around a need for connectivity. And I'm very interested in like that kind of push towards local area child poverty plans. And I think that would be something that would allow us on a local basis, on a regional basis, to identify, like, where are we losing ground in terms of play spaces, in terms of that little bit of breakout for younger people, for young families. And I think that speaks both to things like play. It also talks to things like maternity care, because I can tell you that often the community nurse is the first person that you talk to when you've a new baby. It also speaks to things like how you join up school services with mental health services, with healthcare, with childcare. And if we don't focus on that connectivity, and it would be one of the chief things that those local area plans could do, then I don't think that we're going to have a system which we all want, which is that nobody would fall through the cracks and nobody is left alone with a child that they need support with. And I think that is where you would start to see communities speaking up and saying, look, we're losing our green space, we're losing our playing pitch, we're losing that little bit of space for a toddler to run around, and that would be really meaningful.
Thank you, Nessa. That's very to me that really resonates. I only one question to ask you, Nessa. What's a stick hunt?
Stick hunt. Well, I live in a terrace house with no back garden and 3 children under 10. So we go down to the Phoenix Park and we run around and look for sticks. And it sounds really dumb, but I can tell you, for city kids, it's a good time.
Have you ever found a stick nest?
We have not.
Okay. I'm thanks, Nessa. It's something like, when we're trying to pull all this together, it's like that whole area of safe play and growth and so on is something that I think has to be kind of central. I'm moving on to Deputy Paul Murphy. I hope you're there, Paul. Paul, pandemic, cost of living, supply chain, Ukraine, nothing has helped. Everything has further exacerbated the issues facing children in consistent poverty. And consistent poverty is something that we barely touched the surface of in Ireland for the last 15, 20 years. It's never got better. Is there a single thing you do right now to address the cost of living and the longer term issue of child poverty? Is there something that you think is being missed that we could do in a hurry? And I'm conscious of the fact that the government doesn't want to work in a hurry, and there's arguments for and against that. But I'm wondering whether there's a button you'd like to press.
Yes. Hey, Fergus. Thanks a lot for the invite. And just to say, I mean, I agree with everything that Hugh said earlier, including the fact that we could have no child poverty in this country. That's achievable. We're the 5th richest country in the world. That's the goal that we should have. But obviously, the danger is that with the cost of living crisis, is that actually we could slip back rather than get closer to that. So I guess in terms of one measure, and one measure that isn't really being discussed a lot to introduce into the conversation, I think the issue of price controls on fuel, on home heating, on electricity, and on essentials in terms of groceries. It's treated in this country as something, absolutely mad that you would interfere with the market in that way. But for example, in France, they've introduced price controls. And the immediate impact of it would be, the people say, oh, sure, the businesses they'll all go out of business if you introduce price controls. But that ignores the fact that there's huge profits being made on a global basis by the big energy companies. I mean, the top oil and gas companies, the first quarter of 2021, they made $50 billion. The first quarter of 2022, they made $100 billion. But also in this country, electricity companies, food companies, all of their prices, all of their profits have gone up substantially. So I do think we should say we can interfere with the market. We can set price controls for essentials, and that it will be, the children living in poverty, living in consistent poverty, living at the risk of poverty, who will be, those, will be in the forefront of those who would benefit from that. When we talk about people making the choice between heating and eating and so on, that's children for whom those choices are being made. And obviously parents doing their very best to avoid having any negative impact, and often putting the burden on themselves and so on. Obviously, I think there's a lot more than that to do. That isn't the answer. I think universal quality public services in terms of education, healthcare, childcare, in terms of addressing the housing crisis, in terms of increasing people's incomes, those on fixed incomes, those on wages, people having a genuine living wage. All of those things are also necessary. And the other thing I would say, just in terms of the cost of living crisis, I do think there is a real danger at a European level that in response to the cost of living crisis, we end up doubling down on fossil fuels. And the idea that we would double down on fossil fuels, that's the future of all children that's endangered. We simply cannot do that. And so how we respond to the cost of living crisis has to be consistent with a rapid just transition to a zero carbon economy. So that means one of the responses is reducing energy usage. It was good that they reduced the costs of public transport. That was a good positive step forward, but we actually could make a big step forward in terms of free public transport, have universal access to public transport, but similarly prioritize rolling out retrofitting, prioritize attic insulation, so to bring people's energy usage down as an important way of addressing the crisis for everybody. That's
significant, real. Let me put I don't know if this is controversial or not. I'm a pensioner, retired. My wife and I live on 2 pensions from the state, and I also earn some money from writing. Been doing okay, actually. We're doing okay. We don't have a mortgage anymore. We used to. Don't have a mortgage anymore. We're doing okay now. Could I not contribute a bit more? I mean, like, why should I be seen as somebody on a fixed income who has to be helped?
You should contribute more. But there's two, I would separate it out. I think there's a benefit to universality, and I think we should fight for universality because it means that things can't be taken later down the road. If you have very benefits that are extremely targeted, they become a focal point of cuts later down the road because there is the sense that we all benefit from them. So having universal access to public services benefits everybody, but obviously it actually benefits most those who are in need. So like our approach would be, let's have universal access to all sorts of services and so on, and then let's have progressive taxation. So let's get the money from you through progressive taxation, not by not giving you free public transport or access to social housing or whatever.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks. I'm a bit troubled by the fact that I'm not doing too bad. And I have children who are really struggling, and I have grandchildren who are really struggling. But a lot of people my age are, anyway, I won't open up that line of argument because I basically agree with it. I totally agree with the notion of universality when it comes to health and education, and particularly when it comes to health education for children. Fiona, are you there, Fiona O'Loughlin? I hope you are. I can't see you, but
hi, Fergus. Yeah, I'm here.
There you are. I guess in a way I'm going to ask you the same kind of question that I asked Paul around the pandemic, cost of living, the pressures that have grown inexorably in the last few months. And there is a budget coming up. We don't know exactly when. We hope it's sooner rather than later. And the indications are now that it's going to be moved up a little bit. If you were the minister and you had the magic wand, is there a single thing you think should be done to address the cost of living and particularly how it affects children?
Yes, I think that there's a really strong link between education and equality. And I think by addressing the real cost of education, and that's, early childhood education, as well as, primary school, secondary school, and to make that as equal as possible. So the first thing that I would do would be to pay for all school books so that parents would not have to pay for school books. And that,
even in Northern Ireland then.
I think it's fantastic. And I think it would only cost about 20 million euros, in fact, in the Republic of Ireland. I would also raise the capitation grant so that we wouldn't have the voluntary contribution, the so-called voluntary contribution, that puts a lot of parents and a lot of families under pressure. And I would also increase the back to school allowance for uniforms, because as you know, Fergus, from your time in Bernardo's and the credit union do an excellent survey every year about the impact of going back to school in September and what that costs families. And I remember about 2 years, maybe it was probably 2019, actually, it was pre-COVID. With something like 72% of families actually went into a form of debt. There's something like 48% of families borrowed more at that time of the year. So I hate to think what a similar survey would show this September. So that would absolutely be the very first measure that I would.
I don't want to cut across you, and I haven't cut across anyone else, and please don't think I'm being rude. I'm cutting across you because I totally agree with that. I totally agree with your idea. My only problem is, it's the one thing, if a government doesn't want to have a budget till October, November, December, that is the one thing that needs to be done now. If it isn't done now, 100% it won't have any effect until next.
100% agree. And then moving on from that, what I think I would do, I totally agree with having sustainable communities that are around, such as Nessa described there, in terms of having a sustainable community where people live and where they go to school. I always think that we don't use our school buildings enough. We need to be able to have, aside from the formal education that's there, informal and non-formal. So I would invest in different types of activities that would happen after school, at weekends, during holiday time, to give children that are at risk of poverty or are living in poverty that opportunity to learn to be able to excel in other ways. I would also look at how we could provide, because I know nutrition is a key part of it, and you mentioned as well, and that ability for children that are in a disadvantaged area to be able to have that hot school meal. We have a lot of children that are not in disadvantaged areas or are not going to DESH designated schools that are also at risk and need to have that. And a lot of our schools now have good functioning kitchens, as indeed have community centres. And I would be really looking at how we can put funding into having those, both in terms of having lessons around cookery and nutrition, maybe for young people and for their families, and to be able to provide food and that whole thing. I think about, you know, teach a boy to fish and you'll feed his family for a generation. So we need to have thinking about that. I would give every single school a homeschool liaison teacher, because I think the homeschool liaison teacher has a really, really important role in terms of working with families that are at risk of poverty and working with the schools and with other agencies to be able to try to tackle that. And again, because that's only limited to our DESH schools, as are indeed other programs that will help support and enhance. So that would be my key focus. It would be really putting funding into those types of intervention that will help the children that are at risk.
And doing it now, in the case of
now, yeah.
If you want to thank you for
Thanks,
that.
Fergus.
I want to move on to Aon O'Riordan, and I want to ask you a question about cost of education and barriers to education, Aon. But I also want to I want to show you a bee in my own bonnet. For 20 years now, I have been astonished by the fact that when we decided in Ireland that we needed to introduce preschool education, we set about doing it by giving grants to private providers. And the last time I looked at it, I can't quote accurate figures right this minute, but the last time I looked at it, we were giving grants to something like 4,000 private providers of preschool education, who could only make a profit by charging very large fees and paying very low wages. There is no other model that we allowed to work. Aon, isn't it time that we scrapped that model and went back to basics and built from the ground up a proper system of preschool education?
Yes, I do. I fundamentally believe that. I mean, it's we stand alone, I think, in this part of Europe and not having provision for that at the earliest years. I agree with other people have said in terms of the early years being neglected. If you take some basic statistics about your average 3-year-old from an advantaged background, that 3-year-old will have about 1,200 words in their vocabulary. Your average 3-year-old from a disadvantaged background will have about 400. So that gap in their oral language capacity at age 3 is huge. Then they come to the school system, and that gap can be very, very difficult to overcome. We did in the past, and we have.
But you never close that gap, do you?
Well, it's very, very difficult. I mean, I know
Not
from my
without
own
huge
experience, you'll have 2 4-year-olds who come to your school, and one will be clean and rested and interested and alert, and the other will be none of those things. And fast forward 10 years, you know exactly what, more or less, unless there's major interventions, what lies ahead of those 2 children. A lot of this is about parental support. A lot of this is about from minus 9 months. People think early intervention is 5, 6 years of age. It's not that. It's actually the first sign of pregnancy, when a mother and a parent can be empowered about oral language, about literacy, about diet. Maternal depression is a big issue. Maternal suicide is a big issue. We don't like talking about it. It makes us feel uncomfortable. So when we had the ABC scheme, it was to knit all these supports around based on what they did in Preparing for Life in Darndale, in Young Ballymun, CDI in Tala. Investing in this is absolutely crucial. And also making sure that it's free and that is child focused, because a lot of the conversation around early years and child minding is, yes, about the ability of people to go to work and about gender equality in the workplace and not restricting the capacity of parents to go into the workforce, but not enough of the conversation about what's best for children. The second point about you were making there about cost of going back to school. In the north, school books are free. If you're from the north and come to live in the south, your scandalized by the fact that they have to put you, absolutely dumbfounded. Okay, now I think it's because the Department of Education don't like getting involved in the day-to-day management of schools. I don't think it's the 20 million or the 40 million that would cost for primary and secondary school. I think it's an institutional cultural issue within the Department of Education. That said, it's not just the money; it's also the conversation that is being replaced by a conversation about money. So if you're a parent, you're going to be chased for the book money. You have fundraisers on your Parents Association. The Parents Association is fundamentally a fundraising entity. You can be shamed into the voluntary contribution. All these conversations at the school gate or in the school community between parents and between the school can often be about money because the school is underfunded, and we have the system, about paying for school books and uniforms and all the rest of it. It's not just that humiliation, which is crushing enough. It's also the fact that if you're talking about money, you're not talking about children. You're not talking about child development. You're not talking about education. And we should be talking less about money in the school system and more about education. I know every other politician here gets requests from schools to take out ads in fundraisers for their schools. I think we have to completely recast our brains and decide that it is pathetic and wrong for any school to have a fundraiser. And let's take that whole conversation out and properly fund the schools in terms of capitation, end this practice of voluntary contributions, provide school books free, and then unleash this sort of burden that's on parents, but also on teachers and principals who don't want to be spending their whole time fundraising to keep the lights on and actually want to teach and maximize the relationship they have with children, because it is humiliating for a parent. You are less likely to go to the parent-teacher meeting, you're less likely to hang around the school gate, and also you're less likely to send your child to school on a given day if you feel you're going to be even subtly hounded for that few bob.
What do you think there's? I'll let you into a little secret. I have made this argument to, I think, 10 successive ministers for education. And I've even said to the minister, not only would this be hugely effective, it would be wildly popular. Might as well be talking to the wall. Why? What is the problem?
I think it's
not a money problem. We know
it's not money, but I think it's an institutional issue in the Department of Education. They don't believe it's their responsibility. They believe that they fund schools, but they don't. We don't have a state education system. You said earlier that the childcare system in the country is privatized. So is the education system. We have a system of patron bodies who run the system. We don't have a state education system, as they have in other European countries. And so the department is very, very keen in maintaining that arm's length interaction with schools. They leave it to patron bodies, they leave it to boards of management. They don't like doing it because if he starts paying for school books, what's next? And I think that's the issue. And I think it's going to take political leadership across the board for all of us to stand up to departments who will point to the constitutional underpinning of the right of a school to uphold its ethos, etc., 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 and to say, do you know something? It's not just about teachers and buildings anymore. It's actually fundamentally about children. And far too many people who work in this sphere and interact with the Department of Education or individual ministers will come back to the conclusion that the two things they understand are teachers and buildings. They don't understand children. And we need to challenge that.
I'll be accused of favoring you. So I'm gonna have to cut you off. But I mean, like everybody who's gone before you, it staggers me that all the ideas that have come forward here, none of them are going to break the bank. All of them are sensible, and all of them will make a difference. All of them. And I'm guessing that some of the next speakers will have similar kind of suggestion to make. Mary Siri Carney is there, I hope. And I want to ask you, Mary, about housing and homelessness, which is a blight, in my view, on this government, the previous government, and successive governments. It has never been adequately addressed. I think it is a national and international scandal that we have 3,000 homeless children in Ireland, and we're a rich, rich country. Is there anything we can do to change that dynamic? Is there anything? I mean, I know building and supply and all that, but how can we ensure children aren't spending their childhood in unsuitable accommodation?
I think that housing is the top priority for everybody, and ensuring that we have delivery on housing. And it is about supply, making sure that everybody who could possibly build housing is out there building housing, and that we're encouraging and incentivizing that. And in the interim, because we can't, I suppose, build it overnight, in the interim, we have got to look at children that are in unsuitable housing and are in homeless hubs, that are in vastly unsuitable premises, in that once they, first of all, we've got to ensure that they have universal access to childcare, and so it's important that their daytime experience is that they have childcare, that in their schools that they have that they're being fed in schools. And the hot meals program, I was with the minister when she launched the review earlier there in the year of the school meals program, and at that she said her ambition is to ensure that every child has a meal in school, so that we tackle the here and now situation and reality while we're busy building and ensuring that there's a supply and that there's an answer. Probably uniquely here, I've been personally involved in the building of housing and supported housing for people who are at risk. And that was back in 2000. It was a Vision 2000 project was the name of it. And our ambition then was to be at a place where there was no homelessness and we were out on the streets responding to homelessness. But we've got to have a dramatic intervention, and I believe the Housing for All is that dramatic intervention. But we also, in the meantime, there's no point talking about that's not going to be magicked up overnight. It is going to take a certain lead in time to reach, for our supply to reach the demand, but we've got to care for children in the whole and in the round. And so I suppose my thing has been to extend the school meals program, to extend the ensure that there is a much greater support on childcare, on making childcare universally accessible, because throughout the country there is a vast shortage on childcare spaces, and we've got to ensure that. And two things that we had our own party's budget thinking on Tuesday night, and one of the things that I said was, we have at the moment, when under the building and development, that in large scale residential developments, a builder can exempt themselves from their obligation to provide a childcare facility within it by coming up with spurious excuses like there are 10 childcare facilities in the immediate vicinity. The fact that none of them have any spaces doesn't seem to get a place in justifying that exemption. So one of the things that I've asked is that, in tandem with us increasing the funding on childcare and increasing a universal support for childcare places, is that we need to vastly be looking at the increase of spaces, and removing that possibility of an exemption actually is one way to immediately act that while we're building, we're making sure that nobody gets out of providing childcare spaces. And we also need a capital investment plan for childcare. We had that in the late 90s, early. We built childcare on an enormous scale, and we need to go back to doing that again. There is a small provision already. I've asked for that to be increased in the budget.
Yeah, it started in Ireland as community childcare. That's how the new approach to childcare started, as community childcare, and that lasted a year and a half or something, and then was overtaken. I'm very grateful for that, Mary, and I didn't know about that nexus of private development and childcare spaces, and it's something that maybe needs a lot more research. I'm going to put a similar question to the one I put to you, to Peadar Tobin from Intu, around housing. And again, a little bee in my own bonnet, Peadar. I've spoken to ministers, I've spoken to politicians, I've spoken to opposition and government people about housing. I'm involved in a couple of housing projects, and I get the same answer every time, the same answer every single time. The answer I get is money's not the problem. Money's not the object. Money's not a problem. Money's not. So I keep saying, well, if money isn't the problem, what is the problem? And I get rigmaroles around planning and NIMBYism and all that. What I've discovered, though, I think, is an incredible bureaucratic malaise around this, at the heart of the permanent government. I'm not criticizing politicians for this, other than maybe they haven't had a shake-up. I know of projects that have been sitting there for 5 years and 7 years waiting for the go-ahead. I know the processes. I'm involved in a project in Dublin City Council. I know the number of steps that Dublin City Council will have to go through before they can go for planning permission. Not after they go for planning permission, but before they go to, and they all involve interactions with civil servants in the department. What the hell can we do about that, Peadar? And how can we shake things up so that homelessness is something that is regarded as not just a political priority, but as a real priority for the system?
Well, thanks, Fergus. For me, I suppose, I think we're living at a time where there's a large number of what I call tolerated crises. Okay, so in many of the areas that we have discussed here, we all recognize that there are significant crises happening. However, I believe there's a level amongst the establishments that this is a tolerable level of these difficulties. Because if they were intolerable crises, they would demand a far more urgent and response in terms of the government and in terms of the permanent government. And the permanent government is, for me, is a bugbear of mine as well, to be honest, because I do believe that the political system that we have often puts ministers onto treadmills and runs those ministers, fills them with documents and materials, and makes them very, very busy at delivering what the department wants to be delivered. And I've spoken to ministers before who've said, listen, Peadar, he says, I've been surrounded by people with PhDs and masters who have been 20, 30, 40 years in their particular departments, and they can think of 100 reasons why X, Y, and Z shouldn't happen. And in many ways, I think they are running circles around some of the elected representatives in this country. And I do think that we need to rebalance the authority that exists both in local authorities and in Leinster House as well, so that the authority is far more from the democratic elected representative, and the public servants implement the will of the democratically elected representative. I think that really needs to be reordered. One of the biggest sins, I believe, that exists in the housing situation at the moment is just the fact that there are so many vacant homes. Now, I know that vacancy is part of function of the churn that exists in the housing market. So, people are moving out of houses, people are selling houses, people are doing houses up, etc. But even the last census has shown there is a significant number of vacant homes. And I can think of my own constituency of towns and villages where every second home on the main street is vacant at the moment. That you could nearly play hurling up the main street of the town in the middle of the day because there's so little traffic and there's so little people living in those homes. And I do think that there is an institutional resistance, especially from the Department of Finance, in putting into place a proper vacant home tax. So in other words, a proper carrot and stick, that if a home is vacant after a period of time and there's no logical reason for it, well, then it becomes a cost to the owner of that home, and that cost is ring-fenced, and that money then is put in place to provide grants to young couples who want to be able to do up those homes and start to move their families into them.
What's the period of time you'd have in mind, Peadar? And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but the period of time. I mean, if a home is vacant,
I would say that there's if the home is vacant for no good reason for longer than 3 years,
if it's vacant and there's no for sale sign on it.
Yeah, if there's no good reason after 3 years, I think that there needs to be a taxation put into place. And remember, even the vacant sites tax that we had previously, in its final year, only took in 21,000 euros. It was probably the first time that I've ever seen a tax take in less money than it cost to draft the tax. So
I could give you a few examples.
Absolutely, but I do think there is a resistance, and I do agree with your point wholeheartedly that we need to have a public service which is doing the job of the elected politicians and not the other way around. And just a couple of points, if I can, to respond to maybe some of the other speakers.
I'll give you 30 seconds because we haven't been encouraged.
I do think one of the great lies that exists in Irish politics is, and we have this at election time every time, is that we will provide European services on American taxes. And it goes back to your point about in relation to where does the incidence of tax lay to pay for all of the wonderful services that people before me have been speaking about. And unless we actually admit that if we want European services, we've got to have them on the basis of European taxes, well, then we're going to be going around in circles with underfunded services in crisis for decades to come.
Okay, thanks, Peadar. I'm grateful, and I'm grateful you squeezing in that final point without overdoing your wearing out your welcome, as it were. Jennifer is our last contributor, and Jennifer Whitmore's representing the Social Democrats here. I'm going to ask you a very practical question, Jennifer, because I had my grandkids here this morning because they're now on school holidays, and they're loving it and they're having a great time and so on. I know communities where school holidays means hunger. I know communities where school holidays means a divorce from school meals. And there are kids who, whose nutrition quotient goes down when they're not in school. Is there anything we can do about that? Because it's a fundamental problem.
Absolutely. I just want to say thanks for having me on today. And also, I suppose, to the Children's Rights Alliance for keeping this issue to the fore of the discussion. I think the fact that we have children in this country that are going hungry is a disgrace. A lot of the issues that we've been talking about today are shameful. So, the issues of poverty, homelessness, lack of space for children, lack of play facilities, all that, they are an absolute shame. And I think hunger and the fact that we have hungry children is another shame that we do see in this country. I think there's quite a simple practical measure that could happen, and I think the government has gone some way to dealing with it. So I think that the school meals program that was extended during COVID, to essentially as an outreach for those children that do face food poverty. I think that was a really good move, and actually I think the government should extend it and continue moving with it. What we're seeing with the really high rates of inflation at the moment is that one of the drivers is food, and our food security is going to worsen, I think, over the coming months and potentially years. So I think it's really important that the government gets ahead of that, and they could do it very simply by expanding that school meals program so that it does include the summer period. But I think on top of that as well, we do need to see it expanded beyond the children in the schools that it reaches at the moment. And I know Senator Mary Syria-Carney did say that there is a review of this at the moment that's happening. What I would say is that the children who are suffering food poverty and their families at the moment, they cannot wait for a review to go on for another 4 or 5 months. And I think there is a clear problem there. And really what I would like to see happen is that the government bring forward the results of that review and expedite that programme to ensure that it's a very fast measure that can be implemented. I also wouldn't ask, I'm saying, don't wait until the October budget, because I do think there's things that need to be done now. And I think that is one of them, which is the expansion of that school meals programme. And I think that would actually have a big impact for not a hugely high additional cost or, resource effort, because I think the systems are in place at the moment. So I think that's something that should and must be done.
So just explain to me what that would involve. That means keeping school kitchens open, keeping staff at work?
Well, there's a lot of facilities that would also offer this service as well. So it's essentially enabling them. They get funding to keep that program going over the summer months. So
I know, for example, of a few community kitchens that I would work with, who very often operate on the basis of Meals on Wheels for older people and so on. You're saying a little bit of extra funding might enable them to open at lunchtime for kids?
Yeah, or there's actually, or I mean, I think if you're looking to expand it, it's what mechanism you would expand it. But there are entities, community services at the moment that do provide those meals. And in 2020 and 2021, during the summer months, there was funding provided for that. I think it's something like, is it 200,000 children receive the school meals program? So I think it is, that I suppose the structure is there. It's just a matter of the government announcing now that they will continue it during the summer, expand it. But then also that I think the school meals program needs to be expanded to all schools from September. But it does mean that the government would have to take a very quick decision and not wait until the October budget to really get that in place. But I think, if we all know what's going to happen, we know food poverty is an issue. We know that there are parents struggling. We know that there's children that are suffering as a result. And I think that is something that could be, quite quickly implemented.
I'm very grateful, Jennifer. Some of what you said there I didn't know, which is a mark of my own ignorance, and I should know. I'm going to ask all the panelists now, if they're still with us, if they come back on camera for a brief Q&A. We've only a few minutes. and I have a few questions that have come in. I'm going to ask some of them a little bit at random. You have to forgive me now because I have to get them off my screen. Long-term, Louise Bayless has asked a question. Long-term social recipients living alone get additional support such as living alone, allowance-free transport, and so on. Lone parents don't receive this as they're not seen as living alone. However, with the qualifying child increment rate at 40 per week, they need to use that instead of using it to meeting the needs of their child. This is one of the reasons why lone parent households face more deprivation and poverty than others. Is this something that politicians think should be fixed? If any of you don't want to volunteer, I'm going to throw the question in the first instance. I'll throw it to you, Paul, if you're there. Lone parent families traditionally, and we know from research, are far more at risk of poverty than others. Is there a thing that you think could be done, could be fixed? No, I'm not hearing.
Paul is not here, I don't think.
Nessa, do you want to have a go at it then? I can see you. So, yeah.
Well, in fairness, I see Deputy Funchion is wanting to come in.
All right, Kathleen. Okay, Kathleen, but you're not off the hook, Nessa. Kathleen first, okay?
Thanks, Nessa, as well. Yeah, no, this is a really important issue because lone parent families are definitely at a higher risk of poverty. So I think it comes back to everything we've been saying. So like obviously if we have greater access to affordable childcare, that would be a help. If you have access to affordable housing, that would be a help. But I do think that there's a need for core social welfare payments to be looked at as well in terms of increases. And what I often think is there's very little common sense sometimes in the way these are administered, like even that the job seekers transitional payment. When your child gets, I think, to the age of 14, you then go from lone parent potentially onto job seekers transition. There's all these sort of different changes, and it doesn't take account of the fact of people's circumstance. I know of people who had gone back to full-time education that were kind of going to be left then in poverty, and yet they were trying to actually get back to education, do a degree or a course to get into work full time, and they were kind of being penalised. So I think in general, when we look at it, there is no common sense in the system when it comes to how some of the social welfare rates and payments are determined. But I would agree that it needs to be looked at the core rates, but really we do need to look at all of the other wraparound stuff in terms of like education, childcare, housing, everything that we've been speaking about, because that is really the long-term way out of poverty. But I do think that core social welfare rates need to be looked at, and that has always bothered me about the age cut off in the job seekers transitional, because I just know so many, and it nearly always affects women. I know it does affect some men, but generally it affects women that have been really negatively affected by that have ended up maybe giving up on going back to education, which is just absolutely not what you want at all. So I wanted to come in on that because I feel strongly about that part of it.
Great. Nessa, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just with my budgetary oversight hat on, I think that lone parents are a really good example of an economic group that has been allowed to kind of fall through the cracks and be treated differently. And what we've seen from departments in the last few years is a real engagement with the idea of gender proofing and poverty proofing budgetary decisions and more evidence-based decision making. And the OECD has been very critical of Ireland for not doing that, having a very political annualized budget system, and we don't necessarily make decisions based on good evidence. And I think if we were doing that, that wouldn't have happened to lone parents. And I think child benefit and its kind of real effectiveness and its lack of increase, that's a really good example of where we haven't done that properly and we haven't actually kept up with inflation. And to add to that, the thing that we could do to really address that, and I noticed it came up at the economic dialogue at NED last week, was a kind of an increasing interest in the idea of indexation. Almost every EU country has indexation of both welfare and of tax. And that's one thing that we could do. It's not binding for any government and it's not binding binding on budgets, but it does give a baseline of where we should be going for, you know, particular cohorts, children, and for lone parents. And that's an immediate thing that we could do that would kind of eke away every year at getting the numbers right.
Thanks, Nessa. In my Bernardo's days, I was aware of a direct link. I couldn't ever prove cause and effect, but I was aware of a direct link between frozen child benefit and rising rates of child poverty. And I believe in my heart that money directed directly at mothers in respect of their children is one of the great bricks in the wall of ending child poverty. Josephine Bleach says early childhood home visiting has been proved to bridge the gap. I take it Josephine is talking about the community nursing thing that we were talking about earlier. June Tinsley asked a question about children with disabilities, whom we haven't mentioned in any particular way. There are cases going on in the courts at the moment around profoundly deaf children who are effectively locked out of education. There are children with intellectual disabilities, you know, and there are huge battles going on to get them places. I'm going to ask the question generally. Maybe you might have a go, Peadar. How do we get children like that sufficiently up the priority list? Because in my observation and experience, they're way, way down the bottom now.
I think Peadar's gone.
Well, Leon, you have a go. When I can see you, you're in the process.
Well, look, we spent a lot this week talking about autism. And I think a lot of, you know, every public rep here, and again, the bells are going, so I hope that doesn't interfere with people's listening, has been about the failure of the public system actually to provide for children and to provide for families. So we have, you know, a very long waiting list for assessments, very long waiting list for individual interventions, 36 months. I love the way these things are counted in months, because 36 months is actually 3 years, but 3 years sounds an awful lot longer than 36 months. And then we have the issue around access of basic school places. And what happens in a family is that a family who is dealing with this new diagnosis is trying to get used to it, trying to learn something about it, balance that and their other children, and that sort of, you know, dynamic within a family that can be difficult, and they become exhausted from the process, and they lose faith in the system, they lose faith in the state, and they are kind of almost encouraged to go private if they have the money. If they don't have the money, it means that, you know, their children are going to languish on a waiting list for an assessment or an intervention, OT or speech and language therapy, and then they have to go to the ward to try and get their child a school place. Again, so much of what we do here is based around the privatization of, you know, what should be a basic provision. And I would agree with what Peadar said earlier, by the way, and I want to make this point about our assumption that we can have European style or Scandinavian style services with American taxes. This stuff has to be paid for. And if anybody is to prioritize, you know, the cutting of taxes or whatever, and also to say we can have excellent public services, it isn't true. It isn't true. And if we can learn anything from the last economic crash, when public expenditure went from 18 billion to 60 billion over the course of 10 years, and they were cutting taxes all the way and narrowing the taxation base. And then when the crash came, you know, everybody blames the banks. Only 20% of our debt is actually bank related. Most of it is because we were borrowing money to pay for that gap. The basic point is that we need to have an honest, grown-up conversation about what we're going to spend money on and why it's important. And if you front up with your political manifesto saying what's most important here is tax cuts or an individualization of that message, well, then you're going to have to then justify why everything that's being said today isn't as important.
I'm going to ask one other question, and it arises from what you just said, Alan. I tend in the various walks of life that I wander around in, I tend to ask a lot of questions, and I'm always staggered by the amount of money we spend on services for people with disabilities. In the health system, we spend 2 billion. In the education system, we spend 2.5 billion. We spend 25% of this budget, 25% of that budget. Services for vulnerable children, we spend millions and millions in TUSLA and other bodies. We spend so much money that if you divided it up by the number of children, particularly the number of children with particular needs, we're spending an awful lot per child, and we're not getting decent services. I'd love somebody to hire me, a forensic economist, to do the kind of analysis that would enable me to say, put the money into the children for Jesus' sake. Mary, you wanted to come in. Sorry.
Well, I mean, just one more point on that. Look, we get an awful lot right. We do get an awful lot right, but we do get some things wrong. And 1/3 of the children that leave primary school, DESH schools, have basic reading problems. And 17.9% of our adult population are functionally illiterate. And a lot of this comes down from the failure of the state actually to take responsibility. I've spoken about the education system before. So I think, I think sometimes that, yes, we do have had successes, and some of the things that we've tried, I see Josephine Bleach there talking about the home visiting service. That's been trialed in places like the Docklands and in Preparing for Life in Darndale, and it's worked. So often we don't focus on what has worked and focus on what is wrong. But certainly, in terms of the stats around literacy, we have something that's fundamentally wrong. And I go back to the point again about the state taking responsibility for it, and also politically us taking responsibility for funding those services. I know you say money isn't the problem, but often, funding and resourcing can be a problem. But you can't have both. You can't say, something. I'm gonna make you feel that you're part of the squeeze middle, and that these people over here are getting away with it, and these people down here are getting everything for free. And, I'm just going to cut your taxes and you're just going to make your life better. And then on the other hand, say, well, it's all about child poverty, it's all about services, and it's all about disability, it's all about homelessness. You can't do both, and you have to pick one.
Seems fair to me. Mary, you wanted to come in, and maybe you want to challenge that. Maybe you can do both.
Yes, I do want to challenge that, because there are people who we need to ensure that them going out to work is actually paying, because they are left paying for an awful lot without any supports. So I do believe that there is an argument for us to ensure that those who are in lower to middle income get a support, and that this budget is directly targeting them too. But
you're not saying we should be cutting taxes in this budget, Mary, are you?
I am saying that we need to be ensuring that work pays for people who are going out and working hard every day, and that are paying for everything and don't get supports. They also need the support to be able to buy houses. They need to, and we have an initiative under the Housing for All coming now in that, but for first-time buyers in that regard. So there is a cohort that are can be a working and yet experiencing poverty. So we need to be alive to that possibility and that as a fact. But I want to come back to children with disability, because I think that we have. Money is not an issue here. Where the issue appears to be in the management of the services, in the recruitment, and Deputy Function is on here as the chair of the Children's Committee, and we've had the HSE in there. We've sat in a joint committee with the Disability Matters Committee, and in that context, it is the absolute. The failure of the recruitment policy within the HSE, that we are vastly under recruiting for the disability network teams, the community disability network teams. We need to be ensuring that there's a focus on that we have the right number of places in college, that we're incentivizing people to come into that area of work. And it's a very slow. One of the things that I cited to the HSE myself when I was in, that I know personally people who are in the recruitment process since September of last year, and it was April and early May before they were offered positions that were desperately needed positions. So something is desperately failing there, even from a very rudimentary HR perspective, that we have availability of people, we have a desperate need, and the two aren't meeting. And the consequence of that feeds into, we don't then have the metrics and the assessment for children coming into school places who have special education needs. And therefore the forward planning of that, the metrics are not being kept so that the forward planning can be put in place. I'm delighted to see that Josepha Madigan is bringing in more and more and more school places, because a child should have the opportunity to be educated and supported in the school that is closest to their home. And organisations, groups like Involve Autism and the Dublin 12 Autism Group have been really vocal and came in before the committees speaking on that in a way that was very compelling, that we need to be focusing, because it's a bit of a postcode lottery as to whether you will get the services for your child, the assessment for your child, and the place in a school for a child, and it causes undue stress. So the more places that we can have out there to ensure that schools are obligated to provide special education and places and supports, not necessarily within the mainstream class, but certainly within the school, because the whole of school community benefits from that, the whole of family benefits from that. And that disability, we have a proven report that shows that disability costs, and it costs, you know, several hundred a week per family where there is a disability, just in the sheer maintenance and costs around attendant to that. It is really important that we target that with supports.
Yeah, okay, that seems entirely fair to me. You can tell me all about it. The cost of disability, I know a fair bit about that. Fiona, you have a background in this area, haven't you? You've been involved in disability for quite a long time.
Yeah, thanks, Fergus. And I agree with what you said at the start, that, you know, we talk about so much money being spent in this area. And personally, it drives me mad, you know, when there's a question put, or when there's a debate and we just get the answer, there's you know, 30 million in this area, there's 15 in this. To me, we should be measuring the outcomes rather than the money that's going in. And as you said, you know, if you were to put it across and divide by every child, surely there shouldn't be a problem, but there is. And there's a problem, as, excuse me, has been mentioned, in terms of recruitment. They have to get it right, because the early intervention is the most important element, and the support for the parents and the family unit, because as many of us know, when you have a diagnosis, either at birth or afterwards, for a family, for parents, it's difficult. And then you have to start the process of trying to find the pathway to enable that child be the best person that they can be. And unfortunately for so many parents, in terms of trying to find that pathway, it's just so difficult, along with managing all of the other changes that inevitably come into their lives in terms of what this child brings. And while we have, to a certain extent, dealt with getting that diagnosis at an earlier stage, the different therapies that are needed, particularly before the age of 2 or 3. And Adon mentioned there that
crisis in that area now.
Pardon?
There's a huge crisis in therapy.
It is. When you're talking about 36 months, 3 years there, you're absolutely passing by the most important months in any child's life. And it's one that it's just horrific.
Okay, you're very good, and thank you. Jennifer and Asa both have their hands up, which means presumably they would like to contribute. And I'm going to invite them to do that. We have to wrap up in just a minute or so, but Jennifer, I didn't come back to you, but you do have a hand up there. So
yeah, thanks, Fergus. I just wanted to make a point. Mary spoke there about a postcode lottery, and I think that there is absolutely, when it comes to disability services and health services in general, you know, it can be based on what area, what CHO area you're in. But unfortunately, when it comes to children and children's disability issues, I think a lot of the time it's nearly what I'd call a media lottery. And it depends on whether the parents are prepared to put their own story out into the media in order to get their children's issues addressed, or whether the parents can bring their child up to the door. Like I recently had there was a boy from Arklow who went up to the door looking for a wheelchair. You know, and I think it is a national disgrace, actually, that we expect, in order for children to get things that they are absolutely entitled to and that they need medically, that they have to lobby that hard. And I think one of the difficulties is that, you know, parents who have children with additional or special needs, they don't have the time or the energy to deal with this and to push that hard for it. And I think it's really unfair that we expect them to. Like, there was one couple I was working with, and they have a child who's very, very ill. And as you know, they said to me, look, when she's doing well, we don't want to remember that she's that sick. So we just enjoy the really good days. And when she's really poorly, our focus is just on her. So we don't have time to be raising alarm bells. And I think, you know, we do really need to look at our structures and how we're failing those children and those families so much. And I think fundamentally it comes back, we do put an awful lot of money into our health system. I think there's issues with accountability and the structure of the health system, and it's very top heavy. You know, it needs to be, and obviously this comes back to the whole Sláinte Care initiative, like it needs to be a lot more focused at a community level where the resources are most appropriate and also cheaper, you know, and really focusing on early intervention, because I mean, the reality is, for each of those children who are not getting the services they need when they need them when they're younger, they will cost a lot more. Their issues and their situations will become a lot more complex. So it's really, you know, we have an opportunity to help those children when they need it. And I think by not doing it, it really, really causes all these problems long term. So I think we do need to start bringing accountability into our medical and health services. We haven't seen it.
Yeah, Aon was making that point earlier about the long-term impact of not addressing literacy in a child, and exactly the same thing applies. I probably feel the need to apologize to the panel at this stage, because I seem to have diverted you away from child poverty a little bit into disability, which is an aspect of child poverty, but don't ever ask me to chair something, because we'll end up talking about disability sooner or later. I would recommend to all of you as a panel, and before we leave the subject of disability, go back and have another look sometime at your leisure. It's 55 pages long, so it takes a couple of hours to read, at the single worst piece of legislation ever produced by Iarracht Éireann. It was passed in 2005. It's called the Disability Act, and it is the single worst piece of legislation ever produced. And I don't want to make an inappropriate comparison, but it's a bit like the Eighth Amendment. We passed something into our law that has had unintended consequences ever since. Go back and have a look. And if you want to do a word search on it, see if you can find the word rights in there anywhere. The Disability Act, which was designed to confer rights on people with disabilities, the word rights doesn't appear anywhere in the Act, anywhere. That's a diversion and a distraction. Is there anybody else who wants to come in? Did I see any other hands up before I wind up? And I apologize for diverting you away from the core subject. I'm going to ask Hugh, if he's still there, if there was anything that struck you, Hugh, and if you know, what I'd say by way of preface that what really struck me was the openness to ideas. Sometimes you gather a group of politicians in a room around a subject like this, and you're kind of afraid that there's going to be a spitting match and a fighting match and shouting and roaring. This was a very mature conversation where people were open to listening to each other's ideas, and where the disagreements, such as they were couched in a very civilized way, and I'm very grateful for that. But was there anything that occurred to you, Hugh, that you'd like to add to the discussion?
Well, the first thing that struck me was just the point you're making. I thought it was an enormously rich discussion, and it sort of gave the question in my head is, why, if so many politicians are aware of the issues, know what should be done, why are we not achieving it? It must be possible with that degree of understanding and commitment. So in a sense, it was very positive, but a little bit worrying that in spite of that, we haven't made as much progress as we would. I was struck, there seemed to me implicit in quite a few of the inputs, the need for some sort of cultural change of how we look at public services and the institutional nature, and a much more positive look. And I would say that, I mean, my experience from looking around Europe for the last 2 decades at policies is you get what you pay for. You have to be prepared to invest in public services. Several people made that point. It is absolutely true. Of course, you have to do it efficiently, but if you don't have the taxation, and if you don't address the issues of severe inequalities, you will not get good quality public services. I absolutely related to all the comments that were made about early intervention. We had a lot of consultations in the process of the child guarantee from around Europe, and there were an amazing number of really strong inputs about the potential of early intervention and the need for agencies to have outreach so they make sure they make contact. I was really struck right from the beginning about talking about the role of public health nurses. I think that's a very concrete thing that could very quickly make an impact. And then there's the one other thing that I think came up and I think is really important if you're going to make progress and make people accountable for delivering effective services is that you monitor outcomes. If you don't monitor the outcomes, you don't monitor the extent to which services are reaching the most vulnerable children and report and make that visible, that reporting regularly, you don't have the pressure on services to improve their performance. So I would say that's the key element that needs to be in there in making better public services.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up. You remind Shu, when you talked about early intervention, one of the lessons I learned years ago, one of the jobs I was allowed to do in Bernardo's, I wasn't allowed to do much, but one of the jobs I was allowed to do was stand in for Santa Claus several times a year at Bernardo's projects. It was a job I loved so much that I ended up buying my own suit. I had my own beard and had everything that I could add and so on. And I adored doing that. And I learned an awful lot doing it. But I was doing it one year, I won't say exactly where, but it was north side of Dublin. And at the end of what was a smashing morning, a really wonderful morning, I was preparing to float out and get into my sleigh and float back over the buildings. The group of kids there decided that they would sing a song for Santa Claus, and they gathered around in a semicircle and they sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. All except one little boy, I guess 4, who stood with his head down and his hands pointed to the ground in silence. And I was really, I wondered, God, what should I do to him? Did I offend him or did I upset him? What should I do? So I asked one of the team, as we were going outside, I asked one of the team, why hadn't he sung? And he said, because he doesn't know the words of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He was the first 4-year-old I've ever met in my life who didn't know the words of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And I was so intrigued by it that I asked, why didn't he? And she said, because he has never, he's 4, he's never sat on a mum's lap and had a song sung to him at bedtime. He's never had a bedtime story told to him. There's a huge hole in his life because of that, which we're now trying to address. And if we don't address it, he'll start school behind, he'll have his first brush with the law when he's 7 or 8, he'll be in serious trouble by the time he's 12. And I said, hang on a second. We're talking Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star here. She said, I'm not talking Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I'm talking early intervention. I'm talking about spotting something that's missing in a child's life and intervening now. I'm delighted to say that the following year, he was the boldest kid in the group, but the loudest singer in the group. I want to thank all of our political panelists, Deputies Funchion, Horrigan, Murphy, O'Riordan, Tobin, Whitmore, and Senators O'Loughlin and Siri Carney. It's been a very rich, very mature, very civilized discussion, full of ideas. I want to thank Tanya and the whole team from the Children's Rights Alliance, indefatigable campaigners, and today is the beginning of a campaign around child poverty, which will go on. I want to tell you something that you ought to know, because I write a column in the Irish Examiner every week. Ye have just written it for me. I've written down all the key words from your contribution. I've written down all the key ideas. They will all appear next Tuesday. I may or may not give you, I'll certainly give you some credit. I may or may not give the rest of you some credit for your ideas. But what I will give you credit for is enabling a discussion that was full of ideas to happen, full of not recrimination, but full of positive things that can be done. And I'm really grateful for that. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye to all, and thanks to everyone who participated. Okay, look after yourself.
Thanks, Fergus. It was a pleasure.
Okay.